good. And you're gonna tell them that?
Maybe we should get started. We've got 20 and then we've got
Usually prompt OSPI. Okay, Katie? Great. Good morning. I'm Chris Reykdal, Superintendent of Public Instruction. Thank you very much for being a part of what we're sort of calling our first annual update of all things public education in the state of Washington. We intend to do this every December. Think of it as a preview of where we've been and certainly where we're going with respect to the legislative session, which begins next week. I want to start by acknowledging for the last 48 hours, we've had pretty unprecedented rains in our state. This is always a complicated time for schools. They've been dealing with snow events. They've been dealing with Omicron, which we'll get into, and certainly now with flooding. We've got impacts in the Nooksack Valley, the Skagit Valley, in the Issaquah area, the Chehalis River Basin. So to all of our school personnel and to really everyone out there, this event will still continue to unfold through Saturday and Sunday for our largest river systems. And I always remind folks that when we're talking about flooding and river systems, you're also talking about the traditional lands of a lot of our Native communities around the state. So we recognize them, thank them for all things since time immemorial, and wish all of those communities a safe time as they navigate the next 48 hours for sure. A lot's changed over the last 2 years. 2 years ago when we got got into this complication that we call COVID. We didn't know a lot about it from a science standpoint. We certainly hadn't had a lot of recent experience in responding to a global pandemic. We didn't have vaccines at the time, didn't really know safety protocols. Since then, 90% of our school employees, as you now know, have been vaccinated. About 42% of our students in aggregate, and we'll talk a little bit about that later because it really differentiates between high school, middle, and elementary school, but about 42% of our students are vaccinated at this point in time, and obviously we want that number to go up. Our health and safety measures through the duration of this have gotten better. They've allowed for our schools to, quite frankly, be the safest places for kids. It's the one place where there's good hand hygiene protocols, face coverings during their duration, good distancing protocols, and a real attention to safety. It doesn't mean it's perfect, and we certainly have had outbreaks in schools. We'll talk again a bit about that, but we're very, very thankful for the educators across our state at every level who will put their heart and soul into keeping schools open this year. It is our #1 priority. It continues to be our biggest priority. And I just again want to thank all the parents, students, and staff in our school system who have made that the #1 expectation of the year, that we are in person, we are learning with fidelity. And it's gone exceedingly well, although we're really challenged right now, like others, with Omicron, and again, we'll get into that. So let's talk about Omicron. You know about this. The cases are high. What we continue to observe in research internationally and here domestically with contemporary data is this is something that's going to be ubiquitous. The spread of this is wide. It's going to peak very, very rapidly relative to Alpha and Delta. And if it is like the South African experience and now what we're observing in parts of Europe, it also falls relatively quickly. Thankfully, there's a decoupling between the rate of cases per 100,000 and hospitalizations, and even more thankfully, it appears that the mortality of this on a per 100,000 population basis is significantly lower. That is not by accident. In most part, that is a function of how protected we are. As a state that's 90% vaccinated, we're going to fare better than places that, quite frankly, aren't still vaccinated. There are breakthrough cases, of course, but it's keeping people at much lower risk if they are vaccinated. We encourage folks to continue to pursue that. Our public health experts have been remarkable in this. They continue to be the guiding force for our school districts locally, and obviously we're going to continue to follow their lead as they are the experts in public health as we still continue to deliver high quality learning for our students. By now you know that between snow events and flood events and Omicron, our biggest risk right now for keeping schools open is, quite frankly, our staffing issues. As enough staff in a given building or district are diagnosed with COVID, even with the very mild symptoms that most are experiencing, they're doing the right thing by calling in and saying, I need my 5 days of isolation or quarantine. And when that gets too much, districts obviously have to make a choice to close. So folks across the state should expect periodically, depending on the community, maybe a building, perhaps even a district, to have to close for a very short period of time. Again, this is expected to peak very quickly. By that I mean over the next 3 or 4 weeks, with some lingering, of course, cases that are going to exist and taper through time. But we've got a challenging 3 or 4 weeks coming. We've said it before, and I'm going to say it again. I think the governor mentioned this as well. There will not be closures ordered from this office or from the governor's office under the circumstances that we are in. Obviously, the case numbers are high, but with the decoupling in hospitalizations and in mortality, the safety protocols we have in schools are very, very effective. But it is possible that your local district is going to have to make a decision for a short period of time to close just to make sure that folks can safely deal with an infection and return to school appropriately as those time frames are required of them. So we're not surprised that we've got some closures already, but again, we will not have statewide closures or regional closures determined out of this office. Folks should expect that our staffing expectations and student learning expectations are in buildings for the duration of our school year. Again, with the exception that some local districts and local health officials might have to make a different decision on a short-term basis. Please vaccinate. It is the #1 thing that we can do, and if you're observing the graphic here, you can see that our high school students embraced this with tremendous rigor when it became an opportunity for them. We are getting boosters now for that entire sort of middle school and high school cohort. The 12 and older are all eligible for a booster. While we're ahead of the national average on 5 to 11-year-olds, you can see that it still is low. It's too low. The narrative for 2 years has really been about students, particularly young students, not having a significant impact, but it doesn't mean there aren't students who are impacted. We've lost 1,000 lives in the United States of school-age children due to COVID. This does not spare everyone completely or anyone completely. Even our students can be infected and have severe infections, particularly if they have other underlying health conditions. So please vaccinate if that is an option for your family. If that's something you've considered, now is the time to do that. If you have vaccinated your child and they're eligible for a booster, please do so. It reduces the risk of infection and absolutely reduces the risk of severe infection and loss of life. Please continue to pursue that. Let's change gears a little bit to mental health. We want to give you the status of that as we understand it. We have a lot of ways that we look at mental health in the state of Washington. One is data that we get directly from students. We ask them on a regular survey a lot of questions about their mental health, as well as their physical health, their sense of safety, their general sense of learning, and whether it's relative to them. And again, we'll cover a little bit of that. But in the spring of 21, we did offer a survey. Nearly 2/3 of our middle and about half of our high school students reported feeling hopeless, sad or hopeless, for at least 2 weeks in the prior year. This is a common question we ask so that we get a baseline of this over time. That is not new to the pandemic time. We've seen this building for many years prior to that. There's clearly something larger in society than the pandemic, but it certainly continued to accelerate during this last period of time. The good news side is that 80% of our students report having a trusted adult that they can turn to if they need help. I won't feel comfortable with that until 100% of students tell us that they've got somebody in their lives. Obviously, first and foremost is a parent or guardian, but our schools play a key role in this. Our students need to know that there's a counselor or a school psychologist or mental health therapist, or quite frankly, a principal or maybe a favorite teacher they have. They all need that sense that there's somebody they can talk to. We've infused a lot of dollars in the last year on this question very specifically. We've asked our districts through guidance to have a screening tool available so that every district has a way to assess student mental health impacts and then to directly target supports for students. It's particularly challenging right now because even as we've collected better data for students and districts have put more energy and time into this work, there is a need to ultimately partner with community-based organizations for that mental health support. And that's tough. They're experiencing the same labor shortage that everybody else is. So we're all in this moment of better identification and needing to bring more supports to students. I think districts have ramped it up significantly, but at this point it is a real challenge to make sure that students get timely appointments, particularly with mental health therapists and psychologists. So we're going to continue to pursue that. We'll talk a little bit about our budget requests that we think will also help in that regard. I do want to thank Governor Inslee just unequivocally for the budget proposal he put forward a couple weeks ago to the legislature. He took a study that we did 2 years ago at the request of the legislature, and quite frankly, he funded it. Most governors don't find the resources to do this. He made a priority of improving what we call our prototypical school model. This enhances the funding in all of our schools for social workers, counselors, school psychologists, parent outreach coordinators, mental health supports. Every school district would see a benefit from this. And again, while we're in a labor shortage, it might be difficult in the short term, but these kind of investments now pay very long-term dividends. I want to thank the governor and really ask that the legislature take that request when they've got these additional resources and make permanent these enhancements to our schools. Not with the one-time money we've seen from the federal government that's going to go away, but with permanent state dollars that obviously create that confidence that districts can hire these folks, keep them and retain them, and build supports for students over the long term. Let's jump to graduation data. This time of year, we would typically report on graduation data from the prior year. We have that. Our graduation rate's at 82.5% for the prior year. Excuse me, that's a 4-year number. And we always report this in a 4-year cohort number. So we look at how many of our 9th graders started with us and how many graduated in 4 years. We also look at it in 5, 6, and 7 years. That 82.5% is about a 0.4% reduction from the prior year. It was somewhat disproportionate. We saw further improvement in graduation rates for our Black African American students by 1.4%. So we're continuing to close that gap, which is very, very exciting. Asian students grad rate increased by 1.1%, and English learners at about 0.5%. On the other side of the coin, low-income students, again, they're mostly identified by qualifying for free and reduced price lunch. We saw a decline there of 1.1%. Our Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander students declined by 2%. In foster youth, a decline of 2.1%. I want to particularly point out that our schools are such a center of stability for so many students beyond academic learning. This is a place that for many students, they're connecting to other public services, whether it's a lunch or breakfast and a lunch. Maybe this is where they're getting mental health supports. This is perhaps a place where the school has helped them network to housing supports or transportation needs for their family. When we weren't in school last year for the predominant amount of time in most of our districts, we definitely saw impact. It is why we are so committed to keeping schools open this year, even through some short-term closures that may be necessary due to Omicron. There is simply no question that our public schools have become an essential human service partner with county governments and nonprofit organizations to create a comprehensive set of supports for our young people. We see that in the grad data here. We saw some improvements in some groups, but we saw some reduction in others, and there's no question that we have to double down on that. The 5-year graduation rate, by the way, improved from 83.9% to 85.6%. Again, what I said to folks a year ago was we were starting to build last year a growing number of seniors who had incompletes or no credits. They were making progress, but due to their remote status, you had educators not quite confident that they were meeting learning standards, and we encouraged them, don't just give them Fs. If this is a question of them not having connectivity due to broadband issues or something else, provide an incomplete or a no credit, and then have them come back and demonstrate proficiency. And they've done that, and so we're seeing our 5-year grad rate numbers climb. As a result, we continue to see more graduates in terms of volume and a significant increase over the last 10 years. It's very, very exciting. It means our schools are working really hard to support our students, and obviously that pays big dividends for them socially, economically, and our overall society. Our Native American students had a decline of 2.7%. We're looking at that a little further. Last year, they had a significant increase, and we think there's a lot of activity in waivers that may have contributed to their rise last year and a slight fall this year, so we've got a little more work to dive into there. The emphasis I would place on graduation has not changed. A lot of people take this for granted, and they want conversations about all the students that we need to get into post-secondary transitions, and we believe in that here deeply. 4-year degrees, 2-year degrees, apprenticeship programs, straight to work, military service, you name it. It is becoming an economic imperative that students have a post-secondary opportunity. Most of them will not take that opportunity unless they also have a high-quality high school experience. So thank you for the attention on grad rates. It matters a ton still. When you have 15% or 14% of your students still not achieving a graduation, that's a very big deal for them, and it's a very big deal for our society. So I'm very proud we continue to make progress, but we've got a long ways to go on that. This is also an unusual time of year to talk about assessments. Generally, we assess our students in the spring based on a requirement by the federal government, and then we would be reporting sometime thereafter. This year, we administered a fall assessment. As you may recall, the federal government requires testing in certain grades and certain subjects, and that is a federal mandate. We do not have that here as a standalone state requirement. We actually piggyback on the feds under that mandate. The feds canceled assessments in 2020. And in 2021, they gave school districts across the country and states the option to test. Most states continued with their test in the spring, but what we observed was enormous discrepancy in who was testing. Students who were in person in other states were testing at decent rates, and remote students were not. Their test results, quite frankly, were invalid. They were not telling in any way. We didn't think that was appropriate. We pitched a better way to the federal government, which was to sample. We had a concept where we could get a statistically significant sample of students who were remote and in person last year, do it by grade level and subject, and have really statistically significant results for that. They did not go for that. They said test everybody, but they also said, if you want, you can test them in the fall. And that's what we did. So we did not test last spring. We thought it was too much of a disruption for the already limited in-person instructional time, so instead we did it this spring with a shortened exam, or this fall. I would remind you that the assessment was a different one this fall. It was at a time when students were somewhere between 5 and 13 months after the time period in which they learned. And so we pursued our assessment. The good news is we had 90% participation rate, so we're confident in the breadth of what we did. But unfortunately, because you're testing students this fall on content that they learned last year, we expected to see a dip in those results, and we certainly did. We've tried to compare this in every way that we can. Was there a pattern by East and West? Was there a pattern by in-person or remote? Was there a pattern by something else? It just seems to be an overall reduction in obviously small numbers, small percentages of the total scale score, but impactful as we expected. A lot of remote learning was going to be impactful. A little more impact for younger learners than high school age students, but again, we're not going to spend a lot of energy here because there's too many factors that are unique. Our reminder here is that we also will assess this spring. So this spring we'll be back to our traditional testing cycle in which we assess students in the year in which they learn the content and the learning. So this spring will give us a much better and more accurate understanding of where our students have fared through the pandemic. So we'll report those as soon as we get that and are able to summarize it. All of this will be provided in our report card in a couple of weeks. That might take still probably 4 or 5 weeks, but we want to make sure that our research partners out there and those who rely on the data get it. We again just caution folks, different tests, different time period. They assessed in the fall for learning that occurred last year, which was between 5 and 13 months ago. Not a lot of statistical validity in that, but as I say, we tried to warn the feds. So here we go. All right, let's transition to school funding. I've used a metric in this state since I was elected 5 years ago. It matters to me that not only do we have measures to understand student learning, but how is the state performing in terms of the opportunity to learn? And the way we invest in our schools matters a lot to me. There's only one thing I have found that I have high confidence in that measures the states equally in terms of level of investment. It's a powerful bit of work out of Rutgers University. Because states fund their schools so differently, they're the one who takes the time to say, hey, whether it's a local levy-funded property tax dependent on sales tax or it's state-funded, they actually create a kind of a normative way to look at this so that it mitigates for all the different ways that states fund schools. And the major measure they look at is how much of a state's overall economy do they put back into their public schools. It's their measure of gross state product. You see the numbers here. This looks really subtle, but I want folks to pay attention to that very right-hand side. We're down to 0.2% difference between Washington State and the national average. Now, that's a seemingly small number, but 0.2% is $1 billion. So we are $1 billion short per year of spending in this state consistent with where the rest of the country spends in terms of turning their economies back into investment in public K-12. The good news is if you go back 3 or 4 years earlier when we came into this office, we were between $4 and $5 billion behind the national average. We were 0.7 or 0.8% behind the national average. This is 100% the credit of the legislature. Our Washington State legislature, aided by a nudge from the court, has spent many of the last 4 or 5 years intentionally investing in our schools. Kindergarten, all day. Lower class sizes and early grades, transportation, supporting students with disabilities, compensation and benefit enhancements at market rate for our educators, learning improvement strategies. Our legislature has done the hard work here, and we are now closer than we have ever been to the national average in our investments. And so I want to thank the legislature, obviously challenge them a bit more with closing that gap completely. I would also observe for you, while this state is one of the only in the country to make this kind of progress, it is in part because the rest of the country is continuing to shrink their investment. As you see, that blue line has a downward slope from left to right. We have other states in the country that are continuing to divest in public ed, and they're paying a dear price for it. So let us never believe that the only goal is the average. We want to exceed that. I think a 3.5% benchmark right now of turning our gross state product back into public investment is a wonderful target. It's achievable this year by the legislature, and I think they're going to do do it. And again, I just thank them very much and continue to challenge them to keep going. We do have big challenges, though, in labor. So as the governor has just made this tremendous push to enhance our prototypical school model, he's challenging the legislature to take that last $1 billion of closure and put it in the form of student supports. Again, counselors, nurses, social workers, mental health supports. That is powerful. What we ought not do is dig the hole further. And right now we run that risk. Our enrollments are still down 4% from where they were a couple years ago. Our ask of the legislature is don't force OSPI to pull those dollars back from school districts because of this temporary blip in enrollments. It sounds great to invest in school nurses and mental health supports down the road, but it makes no sense at a time of a labor shortage to have us pulling money back from schools and having them issue reduction of force notices this spring. So we are asking legislature for a hold harmless this year. We want to work with them to make sure that if this is a permanent change in enrollments, then of course we're going to have to make the adjustments to our expenditure models. But we think it's shorter term, and we would ask them to work with us on fully funding that closure, that gap right now, and then if we have to phase that down, that's okay. But that's a $500 million request right now for the current time period, and we would ask them to get onto that expeditiously, because by February of this year, so in 6 or 7 weeks, we will start pulling back our apportionment to school districts based on their enrollment numbers, and they will start making different staffing decisions as a result of that. I am confident that between the governor and our office and the legislature, we can make that happen. I also want to point out that recently there was a lawsuit filed by the Wahkiakum School District. It's a lawsuit against the state of Washington. It really essentially asks the court, the state Supreme Court, ultimately, it'll start in a district court, but I suspect this will get to the state Supreme Court. It will ask them to look consistently upon our capital budgets as they did the operating budget. What is basic ed, and what does it take to ensure students have safe, high-quality learning environments from a physical space standpoint? That lawsuit will take its time and undoubtedly will take many, many years, no matter its conclusion. What I will say to all of this is, for years, my predecessors and I have been asking the legislature to considerably redo capital budgeting. In this state, local voters have to pass a bond vote at 60%. So you need 60% of local voters just to start the process, and then the state has a matching formula. Unlike the operating budget now, which is 75 to 80% funded by the state, our capital budgets are 86% funded by local voters. As you can imagine, if you are in a property-poor community and you need to build a brand-new high school due to fire or flood or just, quite frankly, its age, it is quite possible that you can pass your bond, get all the matching money from the state, and not even come close to the total cost and the total need. Our capital budget system is broken, and the legislature can take steps this session to fix it. Get that 60% down to 50. Ensure that communities that do not have property wealth can still build the facilities that they need. Enhance the matching program. Make sure that the square footage that's allowable is contemporary and meets current learning needs. Make sure that the cost per square foot actually matches costs. And as we all know, material costs, inflation, et cetera, has gone higher. This is something the legislature can solve short of a court case. However, we have one. We'll let that play out. We will continue to work with the legislature to get solution to this, short of ultimately needing a decision from the state Supreme Court. There are more opportunities as we move forward. Again, this is a comprehensive review of where we've been and the current moment we're in, but we never stop thinking about where we're going. And in this state, we know that one of the great things we can do is listen to students. The other thing we do is we ask them about their learning, the relevancy of it. How important is it to them? Do they find that it's important? What our students consistently tell us is they like their educators. They are passionate about their schools. They love who's in front of them. They believe in the teachers and the staff that they work with. They are questioning increasingly what they are learning. They want more autonomy. Certainly by the end of their high school experience, they want a lot more control of their schedules so that it's relevant to their future plans. In a 2018 survey of 10th and 12th graders, only 36% said they felt that their coursework was meaningful and important, and only 38% of them said that the students felt that they were learning what they were learning in school was important later in life. We are increasingly watching our young people grab this device and do their own research. They're asking their own hard questions. They are crafting a world for themselves of information. We've got a lot of work to do to help them understand that this is a tool of goodness and a tool of danger. There's a lot of bad information as well. But no matter how you feel about the way students access information, they are speaking loudly with their feet. They are telling us that this thing has more relevancy to them than a lot of the traditional coursework, and we have to figure out solutions in K-12 and in higher education to close that gap. There are ways to do it. First and foremost, create offerings for students so they get more choice. I believe in our rigorous diploma, and we've put a lot more rigor into it. That's different than not giving students choice. We can ask them to take more credits to graduate. We can ask them to take more rigorous coursework. That is different than prescribing so much of it. So we're asking the legislature this year to create some flexibility within math and science. Don't reduce the credits for them, but give students the choice to do a little more math or a little more science based on their interests. We're asking them to give them flexibility between social studies and English language arts. Don't reduce the credit expectation, but if students really want to load up on social studies, if they want that econ class, or they want that ethnic studies class, or they want that psychology or sociology class, or to load up on an extra history class or a contemporary world problem, let them do that. Let them do that without having to carve up their electives. It's a way of maintaining rigor but giving students back a lot more control of their education. And I hope the legislature will do this. It's one very, very small step that does nothing to decrease our expectations of students and does everything to tell them we want to give them more ownership. There are more ideas that we will unveil next session, not the least of which is we got a lot of young people who need to work. We give them no credit for that. We've got students working 500, 1,000, 1,500 hours a year. It is time to start giving them at least high school elective credit for the time they spend working. The skills they are learning in work, we cannot match in a classroom environment, and they need credit for that. These are the kinds of things that will tell our young people, stay with school, complete your diploma. Everything you do matters and counts, and it builds towards your future. And I'm confident that the private sector, our education system, and our policymakers, including higher education, will help us get to a place where our students feel more empowered over their learning. Also, we're going to support educators in a different way in this state. Most people have never been through a teacher prep program, but I will tell you, it's an interesting thing. You make this passionate commitment to education where you want to develop young learners. Whether you want to teach 5-year-olds, which is absolutely impossible and amazing at the same time, or you want to teach advanced chemistry to a junior or a senior, you make a commitment to young people. And then you pursue this through a traditional higher education institution in which you pay significant amounts of tuition for the opportunity to teach. You earn a college degree, and simultaneously you have to earn a credential. Our office ultimately issues that to be a teacher. You go through a background check and safety protocols. And at the same time, we say, well, where is your experience in the classroom? And for most of them, they have what's called a student teaching experience. Anybody who's done this knows you get sort of thrown into a classroom. Often it's the last semester of your educational experience through higher ed. You've had very little time in a classroom, maybe a little practicum experience. And you learn under a master teacher for a little while. And depending on your experience, they say, go for it. Or maybe they partner with you through the duration of it in really good ways. This isn't how most industries work. Most industries spend some time with their developing professionals under a master teacher. In our case, maybe it's a master carpenter, maybe it's another field. They give them the skills on the job and they pay them. Our educators are asked to pay tuition, often pay for a second place to live while they're given their teaching assignment or their placement assignment, and they accrue more debt in order for the privilege to teach. We have to stop this. We are asking the legislature to genuinely embrace a comprehensive residency model. Think of it as an apprenticeship for those who have not experienced this. That teacher would come out and for a year or more would get paid to develop their skills, to come into the craft of education, to learn under a master teacher, and could immediately begin to afford that life and immediately begin to pay for the final tuition because they're still paying tuition for this experience. We think there's a better way to do it. We have some incredible leaders in this organization who have helped develop this. We'll need partnerships from labor, the higher education field. All of us in partnership have to make a different decision about this profession. It ought not compete similarly to anything else because it's not like anything else. This is the paramount duty of the state of Washington. We need the best and brightest people in this state to want to come into the classroom and teach, and we have to remove every barrier possible for them. So I am really excited about the residency model that we've put forward. I thank the governor for advancing this. I am confident we can get the legislature to understand that we are at a point where we have to do this very, very differently. Other transformations, we're still building out our dual language programs. We are in dozens and dozens of school districts now at the elementary level. Students are learning 2 languages simultaneously. It is stunning and remarkable. I encourage anyone to seek out those programs and go visit them. It is a pretty powerful thing to watch a 6-year-old learning science in Spanish. It's a pretty cool thing. And then they jump over to a math class and they're learning it in English. It is advancing them faster than we've ever seen. Obviously, they're getting dual language, but their skill growth in the other content areas is growing exponentially, and it's totally awesome. Our work continues on inclusionary practices. What we mean by this is our students with disabilities, the research is clear, have a better learning experience and better outcomes when the bulk of their learning happens in a general education setting and not in isolation. We now have financial incentive models in our state that we've adopted to try to encourage more districts and more placements, and more of those individualized learning plans should challenge the system to include students more effectively. It's come with tens of millions of dollars in professional learning for our staff. We want all of our educators to understand the power of the research behind this and to improve their practice of differentiating their instruction when they have students of many, many different skill sets and very diverse places in their learning. That needs to happen in our general classrooms more and more, and very grateful for the work that's been led there. We have 24 districts or more now working on a balanced calendar. Many of you call this year-round school. I'd be careful. We are not adding days to the school year at this point. We think in some places maybe that can be a possibility. What these districts are exploring is how to rebalance their calendar. We have a lot of learning loss that occurs in the 10 or 11 weeks in summer, so could you have longer breaks or more of them during the year, let educators and students catch their breath a little differently, let more critical evaluation of student learning happen during the year by shrinking that summer a bit. It's still 180 instructional days, it's still the same number of instructional hours, but we have districts really exploring what it means to balance this calendar differently, and I'm really proud that this agency has offered grants to a couple dozen districts to get the work underway. I hope someday every single district takes this examination. I suspect we have the ability down the road to do this very, very well. And of course, the growth in early learning continues. We have a great partner in Division of Children, Youth, and Families. The legislature has invested significantly in the Fair Start Act. We want every 3- and 4-year-old to have a high-quality preschool. We want every student who may already be facing a learning disability to have that opportunity from birth. This agency is a partner in that work. We believe in multiple channels, so a lot of Head Start and ECAP, a lot of private organizations in-home. Our school districts can be a partner. We think the legislature is poised to keep these investments going so that every 3- and 4-year-old has a big opportunity. Lastly, on the substance, I will tell you that you're going to see a bill dropped perhaps today or tomorrow, or maybe it's early next week, that's going to finally ask the hard question of K-12 governance in our state. I have said for 5 years it is broken. Education governance in the state is about taking our most paramount duty and distributing it over many, many agencies to the point that some folks in our school districts don't know who to call when they have a question, and we have to change that. We need coherence in policy. We need to simplify the process. The legislature sets the policy direction in the state, and we need single executive leadership to execute their policy, and right now that doesn't happen. I will tell you very unequivocally that I support this bill, and what it will narrowly do in this first round is it will change this position from an elected office to an appointment by the governor. I want to say again, I support this 100%. Governor Gregoire thought about this during her administration. It was the right thing to do then. It's the right thing to do now. It can't be the only change if it's successful, and I don't know if it will be. The legislature will have to figure that out. It can't be the change that will be the difference. It's one key part of it. I think every governor in the state of Washington who runs in the future has to think about 53% of the budget in education, has to put more attention and energy on public education, has to think more holistically about early learning, K-12 and higher ed as a sequence. It can't be another elected official down the street. It has to be central to every single governor in the future, and this is one way to do that. But again, it needs a full reexamination of all the governance. We need to align and simplify who has authority. We need to be able to move, not just in a pandemic crisis, but in non-pandemic times, more expeditiously based on the research. And it ought not take us years to think around the flexibility students need in graduation, or to align programming, or to get youth apprenticeship programs in place. We have way too many organizations spending way too much time on governance and not enough time executing. So to the Senate, who's going to get this bill, and Senator Carlisle, thank you for introducing this. I hope you take this very seriously. It will require a constitutional amendment if they're successful. So it's 2/3 in the House, 2/3 in the Senate, and a vote of the people. I hope it is successful. Either way, I don't want this to be a reflection on the passion I have for this job. There's a fun and interesting rumor that this is a term-limited office. It is not. We do not have term limits in this state. I'll make a different determination about whether to seek a third term down the road or to pursue something else. I'm separating my interest and my passion for this work from what we ought to do in this state. And right now, we ought to align education under the governor to make sure that future governors have total commitment to the work in their campaign and in the way they execute their administrations. I want to thank you. That's a lot today. I said this would be our first annual. We'll do this every year. We'll certainly have engagements in between, but we wanted to put all of the key issues on the table for folks. We're going to make sure we get to a lot of questions here. And then obviously we're available for additional detail on anything that you have seen. We will produce a ton of this for our website. There's already information up there. As we do more research and analysis, of course, on assessments, graduation, and anything that has empirical data, that will also hit the website. We want you to have everything you need as you cover these issues. And finally, just again, a huge thank you to our educators. Our schools are becoming what we want them to be with respect to their representation. They are becoming a more diverse sets of organizations by who's there because their students are more diverse. We're seeing our graduation rates continue to improve as we look at them over longer terms. We're seeing unprecedented amounts of access to financial aid for students in post-secondary. We're seeing more students in dual credit, getting high school and college credit at the same time. We're enhancing early learning. We're thinking differently about inclusionary practices of students with disabilities. We're bringing dual language to more students so they're global citizens. We've added civics. This is a state that's doing really amazing things. It's getting recognition around the country for some of that work. But the moment we are in is really tough, and I'll conclude where I started. The next 3 or 4 weeks is going to be pretty rough. The headlines are going to be about a lot of cases of Omicron. Thankfully, there is a decoupling in the statistics and the data around hospitalizations and loss of life. That doesn't mean we aren't going to have a spike in hospitalizations because the volume of people is so much that get this. But our schools remain safe when local health officials or building leaders or district leaders no longer can staff those schools in a way they think is effective and safe. They do have the authority to temporarily move to remote learning for a short period of time. That comes with a 70% instructional requirement. So this is remote learning where there is full engagement between the staff and the students. Again, these may be for very short periods of time before a return to school. And I am very confident that by early February, maybe mid-February, we are in a very different place in this state. High vaccination rates, hopefully improving vaccination rates for our 5 to 11-year-olds. A whole lot of people will have been infected with Omicron variant, but we have all the pieces in place to finish our school year as we started it fully in person with high expectations that students will have success. And I know that's the commitment of this organization and all of our leaders around the state. So to every teacher, every principal, parent, student, school board member, every single person who has a part of this, every bus driver, custodian, cafeteria worker, you've made a huge difference in bringing back that sense of safety and hope for people, young people, by bringing them back into school. We are committed to that, and I know you are as well. Put your best foot forward to our students. Thank you. We have a lot of work to do this school year. We're here for you, and I look forward to your success. Let's get to those questions. Katie Payne, you will monitor those for us.
Yes, so first we have Dahlia Bazaz from Seattle Times. She says she has a few questions for you.
Okay, Dahlia.
Hi there. I have a few questions back to me after everyone else has asked theirs. My first question is, how would a decision for the school district or a school district to close square with the governor's emergency order requiring in-person instruction be offered? And if possible, do you have any stats on the absenteeism rates for students and staff for this week?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dahlia. I think everyone got the question. We turned your volume up, Dahlia. It was a little low in the beginning, but we got you. Couple things here. We had an emergency order from the governor last spring as the mental health crisis became so substantial that the permanent instruction model remotely was not the most effective way to support students. So he asked us last spring to come back at a 30% or more instructional time. We obviously made a priority of making in-person instruction the default priority. It is now. Our expectation is that every school district by default must come in person. We continue to tell districts, however, that there's already underlying law that in the case of an emergency, a flood, a fire, obviously snow impacts, or in the event of a public health crisis where they can't staff the school safely, then obviously they're going to have to make a short-term decision. They need to document that with us. They are communicating that. They are sharing that with their local public health official in partnership. And unfortunately, some of them have had to make that decision. So I think it squares okay as long as it's temporary. And we also know that districts have worked hard to identify students who don't have high quality remote access, and in those cases they're allowing those students to come into the buildings for the 5 days or the 10 days in which they believe they need to temporarily go to remote learning. So I think that's working out okay. We're going to see this for 3 or 4 more weeks. Then we would expect a total resumption back to in-person for everybody. Tell me the second part of your question again. If we still have you, Dahlia, second part of your question, or we'll come back to you here.
Okay, yeah, sorry. I was not able to unmute for a second. So the other part of the question was how the staff and student absentee rates are looking for this week. I know the last time you gave a press conference, you had talked about, the number of students quarantining on a given day across the state. What are you seeing in terms of student absence numbers? And if you have them, the numbers for staff?
Yeah, we don't ever have those for staff. That's local. There's no data collection for that here. What we get is a lag. We get a pretty significant lag in student enrollments. So we don't have it because we've just come off of break. Our office won't have that for several weeks. So what we do is we inquire with local school districts, and we say to them, as part of your decision making, what is your staff vacancy rates or absent rates at the time? What are your student numbers? That's what's helping them make those decisions. But we'll lag significantly on that at the state level just due to data reporting, how we collect the data for a good 3 or 4 weeks. Eventually, we will be able to see sort of all of this emerge after the fact at the state level. We don't wait for that. We empower them right now.
Okay, next comes from Tom Bonsi, Northwest News Network.
Hello, Tom.
Good questions. Can you give us the latest thinking from you and your office on whether the COVID-19 vaccine should be added to the list of required vaccines for school attendance?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. The question is around the COVID vaccine and about its current disposition with respect to a required vaccine to attend school. It is not required right now to attend school. The State Board of Health administers that process. They are developing, as we understand, a technical advisory group. So they're pulling together experts in public health and epidemiology and pediatrics. Others will serve on that, as I understand. And then they go through a bunch of research, not just the clinical trial information that's pretty widely distributed now, but they like to observe any vaccine as it's been deployed in a society. They will look at Washington state specific data as part of that as well, not just national data. And then they'll consider a recommendation, that technical work group, to the State Board of Health. I don't anticipate that at all this year. I think it's very possible they may make a recommendation one way or the other for next school year. So we'll watch that process. I understand, the recommendation is that maybe our office also sits on that. We'd be one of, 15 or 20 different representatives on that. We will not bring a public health lens to that if we are asked. We will only bring an education lens to that, of course. So right now it is not required. I do not expect it this school year. People have asked me if I personally support that, and I've been consistent. I absolutely support a vaccine mandate to save lives like we have for the 9 or 10 existing vaccines required to attend school if it goes through the full process of review. I don't think I should mandate that. I don't think the governor should mandate that right now. I think we should let public health experts, epidemiologists, pediatricians, and those with expertise build that research case, present it to the Board of Health, have public hearings on it, and ultimately make that decision. If the decision is to add it, I will 100% support that. And I think that's ultimately where we may end up. But honestly, I want to be really clear. There's lots of factors that are looked at, and it's not just whether it protects you, which it clearly does, but other factors are there still breakthrough cases? Where are we in this thing with respect to variants, and how much do they anticipate it changing? Is this something that's going to be a one-time shot and then you don't need it again, or is this more like influenza eventually where the recommendation is every year? There's a lot that goes into that decision. It is not at this time. We want everyone to attend school, public school, come to our buildings, and then this decision will be made probably by next fall, I assume, but maybe it takes longer than that even.
Up next, we have Griffin Riley from the Columbian.
Hi there. I wanted to take it back to the beginning of your address where you mentioned, I think specifically, when teachers call in to ask for the days off they need, they might request that 5 days of quarantine. This is kind of something that we've had some local confusion about here. Is the state officially recommending, or is OSPI officially recommending that teachers and students have the new CDC guideline of 5 days of isolation or quarantine, or the previous guideline of 10 days? I know that it's kind of gone back and forth, so I was just wondering what officially you are recommending districts to do.
Yeah, thank you. This will not come as a recommendation from OSPI. Again, we try to focus on student learning and educational outcomes. This is very much a public health question. So the CDC has clearly made this recommendation to move from a 10-day to a 5-day, and part of that's the science of this particular Omicron variant. It is now the dominant variant. You tend to have symptoms, as we understand, that are virus shedding for the first couple of days. That gives them confidence to shrink it to 5. If this occurs, it'll come as a recommendation from our State Department of Health. We do anticipate they're going to say something about this today or Monday. Maybe it's Tuesday. We stay in communication with them regularly, so we're not surprised by anything. I expect them to move to this based on everything I understand. I just don't know if that's in today or Monday or Tuesday. And I don't, quite frankly, know if this is going to be a standard they require statewide, or if they're going to give some of this discretion still to local health officials. If they do, I suspect it's possible that some folks will adopt the 5-day and others might be able to stick with the 10-day. I don't know that, though. That is something we, like you, will await in whatever guidance that comes from our State Department of Health. But as you've observed through all of this, the CDC says one thing, and then each state gets to interpret that, make their own determinations. Our public health leaders here have just been absolutely fantastic at trying their best to keep public health as the priority. They generally stick with the CDC guidance. Sometimes there's a little variance to that. We're all going to watch together in the next 48 or 72 hours on that.
Up next, we have Eleni Dow with KXLY.
Good morning, Superintendent Reykdal. Thank you for taking our questions. There aren't any schools in Eastern Washington that I'm aware of that are remote learning right now because of COVID, but is there anything in the state level that's going on to help expand internet access for those students who can't get the internet to learn from home in the event that it does happen?
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that great question. We sure observed this in the beginning of the pandemic. The rural nature of a lot of our communities, predominantly in Eastern Washington, but certainly in Southwest Washington and Northwest Washington and out on the Olympic Peninsula, made it more difficult. We immediately put some of our federal dollars into this as an option for school districts. They purchased hundreds of thousands of devices along the way. We had incredible partnership from the private sector when this began. The infusion of subsequent waves of federal aid have allowed districts to purchase more. They are still, many of them, in relationships where they're purchasing monthly broadband plans for families who cannot afford it. The school system has been asked to patch an otherwise kind of broken telecom infrastructure in this state. What I will say is that the last infrastructure bill of Congress gives me great hope. There's going to be significant dollars flowing into our state. I understand the broadband office office under the governor will have a big leadership role in that, and part of that is actually a permanent deployment of fiber into more rural communities. So this is only getting better and better. So in the short term, our districts have patched that hole. They're still giving out devices to students. They can still use their federal dollars to purchase more. They can buy plans for families who need connectivity. Those are short-term solutions, though. Ultimately, I don't think the school system ought to be in the business of managing monthly internet plans, but right now it's the right thing to do. And again, I thank the private sector for some of the work they've done to reach those partnership agreements. But there's infrastructure money coming. The governor's office will lead it. Our state's in really good shape here. Our delegation did a great job at the federal level. That's going to take some years, though, to deploy. Right now, districts are feeling more confident than they ever have that students have access at least to the hardware. Unfortunately, there are still places where that connectivity is difficult. In those cases, in many of them, they're bringing those students into their buildings, even when they have to go to a short-term closure due to Omicron, and I'm heartened by that.
Dahlia Bazaz with the Seattle Times has some more questions.
Hi again. I have a question about requirements or the idea of a requirement for students and staff to test in order to participate in in-person instruction at school. I'm wondering if school districts have the authority to mandate that testing for students and staff, and what your thoughts are on that. I know a few districts have tested this out already, including LA Unified.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Dahlia. You know, I honestly don't know the exact legal question, the answer to this. What I know the state has created as a framework for many, many decades is that school districts themselves don't take independent decisions about health options. That's why our current array of vaccine requirements go through the State Board of Health, for example. I don't know what a rapid test or an antigen test requirement would look like legally. So I won't comment on that. What I will say is there's a reason I think the feds didn't go this route, and I'm actually glad they didn't. Mandating a test in order to return poses a lot of challenges. One, supply. So imagine you were asked to quarantine because you were close contact, and somebody says you have to test to come back. Well, A, I never got it. How do I prove to you that I never got it if I can't get access to a negative test, and in the meantime I'm sitting here at home unavailable to my in-person learning because my school day goes on with my peers in school, but I have to stay home. So I think it's very problematic from a supply chain issue. I also think there is enough evidence that the antigen tests are at a minimum not well understood and at a maximum may not be totally effective or build enough confidence, for me at least, to make an education decision about that. I wouldn't want a student learning impacted because they took a test too soon. So they took a test within a day or two believing they had symptoms. The antigens in their body hadn't produced yet, so it came back as a negative and they jumped back into school, and then the next day it turns out they had COVID. I just think the entire idea of linking in-person instruction to tests as a requirement to come back is fraught with peril right now. And I would rather we go this route of essentially asking folks to monitor their symptoms, get 5 days past your initial diagnosis, make sure your symptoms subside, especially if you had a fever, and when that subsides, return to school, whether you're an educator or a student. We've done that for decades and decades around influenza and other things, and on balance, it's the right way to go. So, long answer, I apologize. I don't know the legal question of whether districts could require it. I don't think it ought to be required.
Okay, I have a couple more questions. Thanks for. Next question is, are you aware of the number of school districts and schools that have had to close down since returning from winter break?
Yeah, our direct contacts to us about that, at this point I would put it 7 or 8 districts or school buildings, and we can try to get you a more accurate count. They are checking in with us, they are informing us. My recollection is it's 7 or 8 at this point, and I do expect that number to grow though in the next couple of weeks.
Do you know what it has been?
In the beginning of the school year, again, it was probably a dozen or so, right at the very beginning of the school year, had to have temporary closures. In that case, it was the Delta variant, and it was public health officials saying, we're uncomfortable with the case levels in your school based on the fact that we have so many districts that are doing test to stay and learn to return. Our districts, for the most part, are testing our students and our staff. That's been one of the really positive things. In Delta, at the beginning of the year, I would say there were probably probably a dozen districts where we've got reports of local health officials saying we're going to take a 5-day, 10-day, 14-day pause. So it's pretty consistent. The difference in now is most of those health officials aren't particularly weighing in on student counts, but rather school districts are saying, I've got enough staff that have called in with positive cases. They need time, and I don't now have enough staff to safely keep our buildings operating. That's more the nature of it right now.
Okay, great, thank you. And then the last question related to the pandemic. One of the priorities you listed in your superintendent vision is focus on overhauling K through 3 literacy. And I'm wondering what OSPI's plan is to make sure teachers are trained in the science of literacy to be able to fill those gaps after they're seeing some of the screener results from this year. And which staff members at OSPI will be leading the charge to overhaul K through 3 literacy?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. The first step we took in this is to understand that by putting an emphasis on early literacy, obviously we had to understand the research. That's part of the process now. And then we didn't have a standalone organization in this place. And I don't know if that was in prior superintendencies, but when I got here, secondary and elementary were together. We have subsequently broken those into 2 different units. We now have a cabinet level position of somebody who's overseeing early learning and elementary grades. So we're trying to put leadership emphasis right now. We've rebuilt the staff around that. So we're putting the building blocks in place right now to have a standalone unit focus on this. Their first question is the research and the data. What have we done particularly around the dyslexia work over the last couple of years? And then they're starting to build for us as the executive leadership team. What does a reconstituted vision around this look like? Both from what should we be teaching? How should we be teaching it? Based on the research, and then what is it going to take for the professional development? So that's still going to play out over the next 6 to 12 months. We'll come into the next legislative session probably with a pretty significant ask of the legislature around this, but right now we're building the blocks right here in our organization.
Our last question of the morning comes from Griffin Reykdal with one more question.
Hi again. I just wanted to go back to, I think, a couple questions back where we talked about digital infrastructure for students. One of the things that some of our constituents have been concerned about is the continuation, or I guess the funding expiring from a federal program called the Emergency Connectivity Fund. A number of school districts in the state in August, I think, penned a letter to Senator Maria Cantwell to, advocate before Congress to continue the fund. And I just want to know, is there any research going on at OSPI to redetermine the need for connectivity throughout the pandemic, and has there been any advocacy efforts to kind of get continued funding in the form of the ECF or anything else going forward? Sorry, really long-winded question.
No, it's a great question. Obviously, our advocacy efforts haven't waned. We want the federal government to weigh in. I think in many parts they've done a ton here with the infrastructure package, but it isn't, to your point, that's more about building out the permanent infrastructure, not the short term. Our legislature, however, in the last cycle put in a pretty good chunk of money to help districts create this connectivity. So we probably have a little more opportunity than some other states right now to bridge this gap. We obviously want the feds to, re-up all of their programs around this. I think you raise a bigger issue here, though, and that is really, at some point, we need a statewide conversation on what it means to be a learner. And as more of our services in K-12 move remote, and I don't just mean remote instruction, but if you're a parent, most of your forms now are digital. Most of the communication from a teacher is digital. A growing number of educators expect their assignments to be submitted through open source resources, digital resources. So we are creating a dependency by sheer practice that compels us to think about connectivity as a basic education right. So our advocacy efforts will mostly focus on getting our legislature to think about that concept as they always explore what it means to constitutionally fulfill their obligation at K-12. That's where we'll spend our energy. We will, of course, ask them to maintain the commitment they made last year to student connectivity. We will continue to advocate with the federal government, but I think sometimes it's harder for us to take our limited resources and believe that we can have impact with an institution that's navigating the needs of rural Alabama, let alone the needs of Ferry County and Northeast Washington. So yeah, we're all over this, mostly focused on our state legislature, and looking forward to both the infrastructure build out, the fiber underground and into last mile connectivities, and trying to get our legislature to make sure we can keep funding devices and in the short term connections for families. I hope there's a better conversation down the road about ensuring this as a basic education right. It's that essential.
That's all our questions.
Well, again, I thank you all for tuning into this. It was a lot, and we intended it to be pretty comprehensive so that as you consider your stories and the way you want to cover both the legislative session from an education perspective, or where we've been in the pandemic, or some of the progress and setbacks, quite frankly, we faced, we wanted you to have the full breadth of this. Katie will have all this available. Some of it's on the website now. More of it will hit the website. We'll keep doing more analysis on assessment and graduation, and again, all of that hits our report card probably in February, I think, is when it hits our report card. And then we've got all kinds of data share agreements and researchers who dive into that further, and we encourage them to do that. Again, thank you. A general reminder to everybody that vaccines matter a ton in saving lives and keeping our hospitals from filling up. I would be remiss if I did not say to everybody, and take my brief moment to do it, please do not go to a hospital, though, with mild symptoms. They are getting volumes of folks, not just from the breadth of Omicron, but we have a flu season cranking up already again, and that's very real. We've got vulnerable adults who really need access to that. Unfortunately, you don't get a pause on cardiac diseases or cancer diseases in the middle of this, and so we really have to keep our acute care settings as much as possible available to those. Monitor your symptoms, and if it's serious, of course, do that. But for mild symptoms, stuffy noses and sore throats and coughs, even in young students, monitor those symptoms. Please do not immediately use hospital emergency rooms for that. They need those available for others. Again, thank you, everybody. Please stay safe in the next 48 hours. To all of our community members and Washingtonians who are in those floodplains, the current crisis of that isn't over for a day or two, and we'll be there. And I should have said for everybody, we have ways of helping school districts in these. We've got a really tough situation that happened in Elmira and Eastern Washington where the school burnt down. We immediately partnered. The governor's put in the money. We're confident the legislature will. We're going to rebuild the school in Elmira, Washington, a resilient community, and a shout out to them. But where this flood damage, fire damage, snow damage, or anything else impacts schools, we have ways to support them, and we will. Thank you. Reach out. Let's make sure we get you any individual interviews you need or questions you have to the citizens of Washington, all the people and residents of Washington. Tough times. We've got a tough 3 or 4 weeks ahead of us. Stay together. All of us doing the right thing together for each other is significantly more powerful than us going our own separate ways. Take care, everyone.